and Tanoto Foundation. The main theme of today's event is the role and duties of policy analysts in the policymaking process practices in various countries. And to commence today's event, I would like to invite all distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to take a straight pose on your seats for Indonesia National Anthem, Indonesia Raya. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, now we would like to kindly invite Deputy Chairman of Policy Studies and Innovation of Public Administration to deliver his keynote speech and officially open today's event. Bapak Dr. Triwidodo Wahyu Utomo, SHMA, the floor is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Honorable Professor Eko Prasojo, Executive Secretary, National Steering Committee of Bureaucratic Reform, Honorable Professor Agus Pramusinto, Chairman of Civil Service Commission, the Honorable Professor Alex Brilliantes of National College of Public Administration and Governance, University of the Philippines, the Honorable Dr. Adrian Campbell of the Department School of Government University of Birmingham, the Honorable Professor Berlin Redin of Public Policy Georgetown University, distinguished representatives of policy analysts, researchers from universities, also institute, ministries, non-ministerial government agencies, local government, association and public administration, and non-government organization, also ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dr. Adi Soryanto, the Chairman of the National Institute of Public Administration, Republic of Indonesia, I am very pleased to be here to meet all of you on this International Policy Analyst webinar, theme the role and duties of policy analysts in policy making practices in various countries. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been widely understood that quality of public policies are the key of success for any country in responding to the dynamic and complex environment and problems. The quality of public policy is largely determined by the quality of the policy-making process, the clarity of policy agenda setting, fruitful communication with relevant stakeholders, as well as reliable evidence base become an important part of the policy process. In the context of making good and sound policy studies and also policy making process, policy analysts play very crucial roles and contribution. Together with other policy actors, policy analysts are required to establish policy network and ecosystem that allows vivid interaction among actors. High-ranking policymakers, members of legislature, civil society, business actors, political parties, and other interest groups need to be involved in the inclusive policy process. Ladies and gentlemen, policy analysts as a profession that is closely related to the entire process of policymaking is experiencing many challenges. The development of issues that arise very quickly in society demands to produce predictive but still agile analysis, quick but accurate policy recommendation, and decisive but still democratic suggestion are just a few of the many challenges faced by policy analysts. The reluctance of policymakers to utilize the result of policy analysis has also been a core challenge in achieving evidence-based policymaking. In order to overcome such challenges, the capacity of policy analysts, particularly in communication, diplomacy, and networking, is absolutely necessary. In addition, policy analysts are also required to be able to conduct comparative case studies in the intellectual processes carried out. To support the environment and the improvement of policy analyst capacity, sharing experiences from many countries regarding public policy practices have become a strategic effort, not only for policy analysts, but also very important for policy practitioners, academics, and other relevant professions within civil service system. In this context, the National Institute of Public Administration, as the coordinating agency for the policy analysts in Indonesia, conduct this event that may provide international perspective for policy analysis and other actors in Indonesia. Through this international webinar, we can promote constructive dialogue to encourage further strengthening of policy analysis in the policy making process. Ladies and gentlemen, by organizing this international webinar, we hope to generate some benefits, such as disseminating knowledge on the practices of public policy analysis implemented in various countries, including issues on integrating theories, concept, problem analysis, and recommendation, etc. Secondly, optimizing the function of policy analysis through collaboration with policy analysts, policy reviewers, and policy practitioners to play an active role in spreading knowledge and ideas in effort to improve the quality of public policy in Indonesia. Ladies and gentlemen, in this forum, I would like to invite all the participants to share the experiences and practices, best practices of the role and duties of policy analysis profession in the institution and also in the regions of all the participants. And I would also like to thank for all the panelists and all the speakers for sharing such very important information and knowledge regarding the theme of the webinar. That's all that I would like to say in this occasion. Again, I would like to thank for all participants that make the webinar happen and have a nice discussion in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bapak Triwidodo, for the insightful keynote speech. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am now pleased to have the chairman of Indonesian Association for Public Administration to deliver his welcoming speech. To Bapak Profesor Agus Pramusinto, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman of NIPA, Dr. Adi Suryanto, represented by Deputy Dr. Triwidodo, and distinguished speakers, Professor Adrian Campbell, Professor Beryl Redden, Professor Alex Brillantes, and Professor Eko Prasojo, all participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the Indonesian Association for Public Administration, I would like to thank and welcome the speakers and participants who are attending the International Policy Analyst Virtual Public Lecture. And today's theme is the role and duties of policy analysts in the policymaking process, practices in various countries. What we are discussing today is very relevant, considering that almost all countries in different parts of the world are facing many problems. We need quality public policies that are able to address these problems properly. And today, we are fortunate to have the opportunity to hear from 3 speakers from 3 different countries who have expertise in the field of public policy. Hopefully, today's discussion provides insights for academics to improve the quality of teaching and research, and also for practitioners to improve the formulation and implementation of public policies. Furthermore, we would like to take advantage of this activity to increase collaboration with the University of Birmingham, the University of Georgetown, and the University of the Philippines. Thank you very much and welcome to the public lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Bapak Agus Pramusinto, for the wonderful welcoming speech. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are now proceeding to today's agenda, which is a plenary session. Joining with us today, 3 amazing speakers from 3 different countries who will be sharing their knowledge and insights in relation to the role of policy analysts in policy making process in their respective countries. This plenary session will be moderated by Professor Dr. Eko Prasojo. He is a professor at Faculty of Administrative Sciences, University of Indonesia, who is also former Vice Minister of Administrative and Bureaucratic Reform. Bapak Profesor Dr. Eko Prasojo, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Mbak Reni. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon in Indonesia and very good morning in Birmingham, Dr. Adrian Campbell. Welcome to international webinar on the role and duties of policy analysts in the policy making process, practices in various countries. Dear Dr. Triwidodo and also Professor Agus Pramusinto. Thank you very much for introductions to the webinar. We are very glad and also very lucky. Today we have very prominent speakers, Professor Gary Redin and Professor Dr. Adrian Campbell and Professor Alex Brillante. Yeah, I think they are very prominent in this policy, public policy, and especially in the policy analysis. I think this is very important webinar, yeah, for us in Indonesians, because on behalf of the Ministry of Administrative Reform and also the Vice President of the Republic of Indonesia, as Chairman of the National Bureaucratic Reform Steering Committee, we would like to learn about practices, yeah, of policy analysis in the policy making process. Yeah. And of course, this is very relevant to what we are doing now, yeah, to transform the administrative system in Indonesia from structural position to functional positions. It means that the professions of policy analysts will be very useful, yeah, in transforming the Indonesian bureaucratic to be more dynamic, yeah, and also competent, yeah, in responding the global challenges. I would like to give some maybe words, yeah, before we are beginning to this webinar. Today, I think we would like to learn about the characteristic and in what condition actually policy, the profession of policy analyst will be effectively, yeah, give the advice to the policymaker. I mean, in the sense of competency, like the analytical mind, yeah, such as rationality, efficiency, and of course, the intuitive mind. And whether the policy analyst should have also the direct relation or personal relation to the policy maker. Yeah. And whether the movement of policy analysts into the academic world or into the consultancy from the private sector, for example, will be also problematic in the policy making process. Since we understand that the players in the policy making process is ever changing and dynamics, yeah, involves so many actors, formal and informal actors, and also involving conflicting norms and expectation from the political actors and also from the society in the wide perspective. Yeah, I think this is very important to us to know that in what condition that the policy analyst could be effectively give the advisory that could be also integrated in the policy making process for the policy maker. Yeah. I would like to introduce our speaker today. Yeah, we have a very prominent speakers today, Honorable Professor Beryl Redin, Dr. Adrian Campbell, and also Professor Alex Brillante. Professor Beryl Redin was born in November 15, 1936 in Aberdeen, US. Yeah. He is now adjunct professor, McCourt School of Public Policy, Georgetown University, yeah, with the education PhD in the University of California at Berkeley, yeah, MA in the University of Minnesota, yeah, and also BA in Antioch College History, 1958. His research interest is on defining policy analysis in the 21st century, yeah. Also assessment of comparative policy analysis approach, yeah. Federal management reform in a world of contradiction, challenging the performance movement, and also the evolution of the policy analysis field. So the recent professional activities from Professor Beryl Redin is, I think he was the speakers from various webinars, since we are entering in the virtual after COVID-19. Yeah, yeah. I think the Professor Beryl Redin has recorded her presentation, and I think will play in this webinar to share her experience, also her thinking about policy analysis in the policy making process. The second speaker is Professor Alex Brillante. He is now professor and former dean of the University of the Philippines, in the National College of Public Administration and Governance. He holds PhD and MA in Political Science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Master in Public Administration and BA in Political Science from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research and publication, so I think he has written many books and also publication papers on local governments, development administration, and civil society in local government and also international journals, including ASEAN Survey, Administrative Science Quarterly, and so on. Now he is Secretary General of the Eastern Regional Organization for Public Administration, Eropa. He was also former of Philippine Society for Public Administrations, former Dean of the University of the Philippines, National College of Public Administration and Governance, Executive Director of Local Government Academy, and the Chairman of the Philippine Social Science Councils. I think he has many experience and knowledge on the policy, public policy making, especially in the policy analysis. Thank you, Professor Alex, for coming. And the last speaker is Dr. Adrian Campbell. He's now a senior lecturer in International Development Department, School of Government, University of Birmingham. His education is PhD in Management and also BA Modern Language Joint Honors. His research interest is mainly in the interaction between vertical and horizontal structure of powers, primarily in a government, especially in a territorial and local government. He is currently focusing on the relationship between modes of internal territorial organization of powerful states and also their favor mode of external geopolitical influence. The personal activities of Dr. Adrian Campbell is the Director of Master in Public Administrations since its inception in 2009, project management and consultancy related to donor-funded project in transitional countries, which he directed several in Russia, Ukraine, and also Kazakhstan. Dear honorable speakers and also participants, maybe I would like to invite Professor Gary Redin. I think the committee has also his recorded presentation. Please show us the recorded from Professor Gary Redin.
I'm very pleased to be involved in this discussion, but I wish I could be there in person. I've tried to develop a presentation that is based on an analysis of two approaches to the history of policy analysis across the globe. And what I'm going to talk about today really draws on a short book that I published with Cambridge Elements about a year ago that's entitled Defining Policy Analysis, A Journey That Never Ends. Now, the first approach I'm talking about is linked to the analytic activity that began in the late 1950s and early 1960s in the US. It emerged from World War II activity and the development of the PPBS analytic activity that came from the US Department of Defense. I'm sure you're all familiar with PPBS, planning, programming, and budgeting systems. And PPBS was found in economics departments and was frequently tied to the early life of the computer world. It's often technocratic, usually quantitative, and frequently linked to efficiency goals. PPBS really relies on data that is already available, and it operated as a tool for a decision process involving budget allocations that was found in the Department of Defense, which was a centralized decision environment. And I think it's useful to also realize that the original staff that were involved in PPBS were more like in and out consultants than traditional long-term bureaucrats. Now, while it started in the Defense Department, it soon spread to other departments in the US federal government. It then moved to variable state and local governments, where it took on decision structures that were more diverse, both in terms of their constraints and their expectations. It reached into other academic fields beyond economics to bring their unique perspectives to the table. Although the policy analysis field started out as a field of practice, its development moved in other directions. The field moved into the world of academia and became subject to classic academic requirements. In addition, policy analysis units that might have employed full-time government staff in the past moved to contract out their work to both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And in fact, the components of the position that was called policy analyst was never clearly defined in the federal government employment information in the past and today. Now, other countries employed similar activities, but to me, few took on the project as seriously as the US did. I'd like to move to the second strain, which has a much older history. And in talking about that strain, I've relied on a 1978 book entitled The Advisor. It was written by Herbert Goldhammer, and focused on what is, I think, very useful for this discussion. The book focused on the processes that involved individuals who provided advice to rulers over centuries across the globe. It's interesting that the author focused on the ancient art of providing advice to decision makers, but he was located at the Rand Graduate Institute. I think it's interesting because that is the think tank that was intimately involved in the original US Defense Department activity. Now, his book draws on a range of writers, including early Chinese, Indian, and Greek writers, as well as Machiavelli and Old Testament figures who bring insights to the advice they give a ruler. Goldhammer's goal was to describe a range of advisors drawn from a variety of eras and cultures that would illustrate the continuities and diversities of a political figure over 4 millennia. Goldhammer focused on individuals who met the following criteria as an advisor. He listed 8 elements. Let me just go through them quickly. First, they were advisors to the supreme leader of a nation. 2, they came from diverse elements in the society, but from established professions. 3, they were almost always men. 4th, occasionally they were wandering scholars who did not see their role as long-term players. 5, they had access to the leaders. 6, they believed that the timing of action was important. 7, they had what was called an analytical mind that drew on calculation, rationality, efficiency, planning, and theory, but but also had an intuitive mind. And finally, their expertise derived from practice, experience, or experiments. Goldhammer's book defined a number of preconditions that should be attached to the advisor's role. He listed them: friendship, admonition, information, education, analyses, advice, and special missions. Now, while some of these conditions are familiar to us all, others are not. Now, Goldhammer saw the advisor in very human ways. He saw the advisor as a friend and companion, as an admonisher or keeper of the king's conscience, and as his eyes and ears. He saw that he plays roles supplementary to what are generally viewed as his principal functions. He is above all a provider of judgment, wisdom, analytic and professional skills, with the ability to apply these talents to policy. Goldhammer found that the demand for political experts varied with political structure, its size, and the relationships between the participants in the settings. It also emphasized the prime relationship between the advisor and the decision maker. Goldhammer, in this book, seemed to be fascinated by the presence of advisors within the social structure of countries such as ancient China, India, North Africa, and Italy. He began his book by noting that the term advisor lacks, quote, both in political practice and political studies, a well-established meaning. I thought that was an interesting sentence because it doesn't seem to have changed as this 21st century has developed. He quotes Kautilya, someone who advised a 4th century BC leader in India. It's advice that I think is really ignored too often. He says, this kind of seeking for advice is infinite and endless. The king should consult 3 or 4 ministers. A single minister proceeds willfully and without restraint, but with 3 or 4 ministers, he will not come to any serious grief, but will arrive at satisfactory results. Now, it's clear that policy analysis in the US today shows little interest in a contemporary version of Goldhammer's advice. Rather than being attentive to his views, there's evidence that policy analysts do not understand the difference between their roles as advisors than that of academics. Too often, they see themselves as their own clients. They search for one-size-fits-all solutions. They ignore the diversity of behavior within the 21st century and the constant changes that have emerged in a globalized world. I'd like to conclude with a little discussion of some of the lessons that I think that can be drawn from these 2 approaches to policy analysis and policy analysis education that might be useful to Indonesia. So I will conclude with 4 issues that I'd like you to think about. 1, the US experience indicates that clear movement into the academic world is problematic. This field, much like medicine, must maintain its dual identification with both the world of practice and that of research. That involves both substantive agendas that include practitioners, as well as acknowledgement that this is a field that will always include conflict between those two approaches. Second, the players operating within a policy map are likely to be ever-changing and dynamic. They often include both formal and informal actors who operate in diverse structures with conflicting norms and expectations. The personal relationships between the client and the analyst are crucial and call for attention to maintaining and supporting those dimensions. And finally, it's useful to identify past experiences, not only thousands of years old, but your own personal experiences, because they give you a history of similar but related issues and potential problems. Many thanks to you all for inviting me to participate in this session, and I wish you well. I'm very happy.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Edin, for very nice recorded presentations about the two approach in policy analysis in the U.S. History since 50s and 60s, and the current development, and also the ancient time from China, India, and also Greeks, Italy, and so on. So we learned so much, yeah, from presentation of Professor Edin. I think we will be talking and question for Professor Edin maybe later. Yeah, I think you could write your questions to the committee and will be sent to the Professor Edin. So now we have other speakers, Professor Alex Brillante. Yeah. Alex Brillante is my best friend. Alex, how are you?
Oh, hello. Apa kabar?
Long time no see. Long time no see, yeah. Alex, it's your
Yes,
turn.
yes.
I will give you the platform, yeah, and screen.
Yeah, okay.
Please, time is yours.
Well, terima kasih, Dr. Echo. So let me proceed with the share screen. And I must say that I learned a lot from the presentation of our first presenter, Dr. Edin. And I think, you know, it's very, very important that I think we'll be able to somehow recognize if you made the origins of policy analysis. I know I have about 20 minutes, Dr. Echo, 20 minutes or 15 minutes?
Yes, Alex.
Okay, so I will time it, my friend. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Of course, Professor Agus, and of course to Gine and Diana, who's been very, very kind in sending this. I would like to say it's always a pleasure to work with you. And I must say, I enjoyed the presentation of Dr. Edin because she talks about the importance of applied. I think in one sense, maybe this could be one major lesson learned. It's very, very important that as a policy analyst, we don't always remain in theory. We have to be applied. I think that's what she mentioned. And I totally agree with that. Because at one point, you know, we, especially as in the academe, we like nice theories, but when you go to the real world, that's not the way it works. My brother Echo, you have been a vice minister yourself one time. I myself was a deputy minister. And when I joined the government, I said, gee, this is not what was, this is not what we talk about in theory. Point difference, there's a huge difference, or there has to be a recognition of the need for application, as pointed out by Dr. Edin. I didn't mean to begin with that, but I did because I wanted to segue from her presentation. Number two, as you all know, dear friends, when we talk about policy analysis, it's really part of our discipline of public administration. No? And as she pointed out, the whole discipline of policy analysis, at least in the US, because this session is about sharing from the experiences of various countries. I'm sharing from the experience of the Philippines, and I must say, this field of policy analysis became quite fashionable, if you may, in the 70s. As a matter of fact, one of our professors who came from, I think it was from Kennedy School, his name is Robert Klitgard. He wrote a lot of books on policy analysis. He taught at our university. And after he left, we set up what we call the PSP, Policy Studies Program, after which our policy studies program emerged into now a big center. It's now called the Center for Policy and Administrative Development. Point, dear friends, I think there's a recognition that even in the academy, we should have a specific specialization of policy. And that's where the policy analysis is concerned. Very much important. And if you recall, dear friends, Dr. Eco, Dr. Agus, and a number of us around the table, many of us are involved. It soon became a whole college, a whole university. You and I, we've been involved in GRIPS, Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. The point is that, yes, we have to look at the specific influence. We have to look at the specific impact, if you may, of policies, but this should be science-based. This should be evidence-based. This should be based on data. That's why even the presentation of Dr. the early presentation, she talked about it originated the RAND Corporation, the use of computers, the use of data. Very, very important. Very important. It's not just saying policies, but they should be evidence-based. And that was really how it has emerged, at least in the discipline of public administration. And this slide just shows the evolution of the discipline of public ad. So I think I will just very quickly, in 20 minutes, locate policy analysis in public administration, which I tried to do, talk about the framework for policy analysis. Since our discussion is sharing of the experiences of other countries, I must say that the discourse of public administration and policy analysis in the Philippines has really been largely influenced by Western public administration. Is that good or bad? Well, it's good, but also not so good. Because I think part of the job of the policy analyst who is now from the Philippines or in our respective countries should be able to appropriately contextualize it within the context of our specific culture, our specific problem, our specific types of leadership. But certainly, the tools of policy analysis are very, very useful to be able to come up with the science aspect. So all of us around the room, you're in Indonesia, we're in the Philippines, continue to search for our respective models. I think that's very, very important. And I'll talk about that also in a while. And I'll talk about some problems and the duties of the policy analyst as assigned to me by your team. And of course, I'll talk about how we can appropriately contextualize it. Okay, this slide just talks about the different fields of public administration: traditional, contemporary, and emerging. I put the policy analysis under contemporary because, as I mentioned, policy analysis as a subfield of public administration emerged in the Philippines in the 70s, but continues to be deeper, continues to be broadened. In fact, dear friends, a very, very specific offshoot, if you may, of the study of policy analysis in the Philippines is now policy foresight and futures thinking. Policy foresight and futures thinking. So you just don't remain in policy analysis. We're not talking about foresight. We're not talking about futures thinking. And dear friends, you all know that all of us got hit with the pandemic. Who talked about the pandemic? We had so many bright policy analysts with so many pages from all over. Was it ever predicted? Not necessarily so. Was that a failure? I would not say it was a failure, but I think it's very, very important that policy analysis goes into the dimension of foresight and futures thinking, as we mentioned. Okay, another point mentioned by our previous speaker talked about the interdisciplinariness. We are not just in public, because as you know, that's the strength, also weakness of public ad. Strength and weakness. We draw from economics, law, political science, sociology, IT, psychology, but at the end of the day, they all come together in the discipline of public administration. That is that strength, but that is also a weakness, as I will point out later. Okay. So here in the Philippines, we came up with what we call a policy pyramid. No, we did this with a colleague of mine. His name is Professor Simpas. He has since passed on. But he talked about this. Policies have to emerge from specific values, the values of the society. In your case, it would be, I guess, the Panchasila, if you may. In the Philippines, we talk about bayanihan, but it has to be rooted in the values of the people. Then the policies are converted into, values are converted into specific policies, policies into programs, programs into projects, and specific activities. Question: the role of the policy analyst should be able to see the linkages vertical and also horizontal. It is entirely possible that some policy analysts mistake, if you may, specific programs as policies. No, we have to be very, very clear about where is the location of policies in relation to the values of the society, in relation to the values of the society. And in our country, it has to come from our constitution. We do have a constitution that talks about this. So, but translated from values. And these values and goals, in fact, difference, if you want to think globally, can even be related to the SDG, to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you have the Sustainable Development Goals, then you have the vision of our country, and then you have the specific development plans, and then come down to specific projects. Point difference, the policy analyst should be able to draw the vertical linkage and how it links to our collective vision, not only of today, but if you talk about SDG by the year 2030. In my country, we have what we call the Ambition Natin 2040, Ambition Natin 2040. What we want to be in 2040, it should be linked to that. So a policy analyst does not only think of the present, he or she should think of the future. But as you think of the future, you have to have this broad, not only theoretical perspective, but also practical perspective. That is why a policy analyst should be multidisciplinary in thinking. Okay. So what are the steps? Some of these, of course, are taken from the classic books of Dunn, Klitgard, who talk about the policy steps in policy process. It's really almost common sense. One, recognize the problem. Is there really a problem? Later on, we'll talk about that. Pandemic. Is there a problem? Corruption. Is there a problem? Poverty. Yes, there is a problem. Number two, the government must recognize that the problem is worthy of attention. In other words, the government must recognize that, hey, there is a problem, because the biggest mistake of policy of government is sometimes saying there is no problem. I think the problem is half solved if the government recognizes that, hey, we do have a problem. But the question is, how do you frame that problem? How do you frame the problem? I'll talk about that in a while, because many times in the field of policy analysis, we frame the problem, quote unquote, wrongly. We come up with what's called an error of the third kind, which I'll talk about later on. Then the third part, policy formulation, you design the policy, but it does not end there. And I think the role of the policy analyst does not end in formula and in suggesting formulation policy. The policy analyst must also be able to design options. And I think this was mentioned also by the previous speaker. I was taking notes earlier. You should come up with different options, but equally important, you come up with a ranking. You come up with your own recommendations. Yes, you have options from simple to radical, from good to bad. These are options. Or even as an option is, hey, let's not do anything. Or as an option, let's change the entire thing. But your job as a policy analyst should be to provide some options. But equally important, and for me, I'll push the envelope. Equally important, you should make a recommendation. But our principal, let's say the minister, our principal, let's say the president, should be able to see what are the options. But you as a policy analyst should recognize the options, but equally important, you provide a recommendation and why it should be done. And I'll talk about that momentarily. So if you look at this as a class, I'm sure some of you around the room have seen the policy process by William Dunn, no? Agenda setting, formulation, it's really cyclical. Agenda setting, formulation, policy adoption is very, very important. And when it's adopted, it's implemented or not implemented. And then what do? You evaluate it. After evaluating it, you revise it, and then you come up again with a revised agenda, if you may. Point difference, the policy process should be recognized as cyclical. And that is why the policy analysts around the room would have their job cut out for them. You will never run out of things to do because you continue, it is cyclical, and you always have to periodic evaluation, which is part number 5. Appropriately contextualized, because when you evaluate it, it should be in accordance to are we meeting our targets? Are we meeting our vision? Are we meeting our goals? In my field, as I mentioned earlier, are we moving towards the Sustainable Development Goals? In the Philippines, we talk about, are we moving towards Ambition Natin 2040? I know that Indonesia has its own long-term development plan. Point, the policy should be measured against that. Okay, so I guess very quickly, I just come from my own personal experiences when I was with the Commission for Higher Education. I was once a deputy minister there, and also I worked in the Ministry of Local Government. And in government, it is not neat. It is not clean. There are so many conflicting sources of sources of recommendations from your minister, from the people in the field, from all over. You are caught right in the middle. That's why the policy analyst should have a clear mind and a clear vision of where or he or she wants to make recommendations. That's why the importance of alignment. When I was in the Ministry of the Local Government, another job that I had, we had some conflicting memos. In fact, the minister was quite upset at me for being part of that conflicting memos. And that's the job of the policy analysis, to provide perspectives. Okay, so as I said, we have to avoid what we call the error of the third kind. What's the error of the third kind? You know, it's the error given by giving the right answer to the wrong problem. It's really the right problem, wrong solution, or the wrong problem, the right solution. What we want is the right problem to the right solution. What we want is the right problem to the right solution. A major problem in policy analysis, really different, is sometimes we have the wrong problem. And very openly, I'll talk about a problem that we have in the Philippines at one point in time, just to share with you that sometimes you can have the best minds, but sometimes if you identify the wrong problem, it's like putting on a shirt. You know, when you put the wrong button first, all the way down, the button is wrong all the way. So very, very important, the policy analyst should have a clear definition of the right problem and the right solution. Okay, and Richard Hemming once said, it is better to solve the right problem the wrong way than to solve the wrong problem the right way. Okay, so look at this very, very quickly. Now, somebody wanted a tree swing project, and this came from different. This is very old. This was done during the 70s, but I think it's still very relevant. Somebody wanted the swing. Like I said, different perspective. Marketing said, let's have this swing with three platforms. Management approved it with three chords, and then designed by engineering, designed it, they tied it around there, but of course the swing wasn't working. Okay, and then of course what was manufactured, you have the swing over there, but of course it will slam right into the tree. Different perspectives, you know what? And then what was manufactured, and then what was maintenance? Of course they cut the tree so that you could swing. But you know what difference? All the customer wanted was a very, very simple swing. My point, dear friends, different perspectives. My point, dear friends, we have to listen. My point, dear friends, we not only listen, but we have to keep our eyes on what we are moving towards. Is it SDG? Is it our goal? Is it a development plan? Alignment is very, very important. Look at this one. This is also is another example of this. So the customer was built. It was very, very, very expensive. But at the end of the day, the customer just wanted a simple swing. So problem sometimes, dear friends, is we policy analysts, we public administration people can think of so many complex theories, and we want to apply them to this. And hey, that's not the way it works. So, excuse me. So the challenge is that many times we in government, policy and policy implementers, think that we know what is best. We need to listen. We need to consult them. We need to listen what is governance all about. But equally important, since you are all scientists, we listen to them, but we have to bring in the analysis. We have to bring in the appropriate tools, including the use of statistics, including the use of important data, including the use. Now, today we're talking about big data. So you just don't talk about things. You have to have the evidence, as pointed out by our first speaker. Okay. So I talk about the importance of alignment to avoid what we call the error of the third kind. Very quickly, I'll give you an example, because I'll be in time, my brother Echo. Here in the Philippines at one point, I always use this as an example. Manila has a big problem. And I'm sharing this because we also learned from Indonesia, your bus ban, etc. Manila had a big problem. So some of our decision makers learned that, hey, maybe we can have numbers coding. So if your plate number is 1 and 2, you don't go out on Monday. 3 and 4, if your plate number is 3 and 4, you don't go out 4 and 5. So they said, okay, those cars with plate numbers, plate numbers, our plate numbers and car numbers are not allowed to go out on certain days. So they came out with that very, very nice policy in order to address congestion. But guess what? Because many people were banned from going out on certain days, you know what happened? many of them bought an extra car. Many of them bought an extra car. So instead of solving the problem, it actually worsened the situation. So is that an error of the third kind? I think so. And I think we have examples in various parts. Okay, so what are the tools? No, and of course we have what we call the problem tree analysis. You have the development problem up there, and what are the causes? But you talk about the effects. I know I have some students here from the University of the Philippines and University of Makati, and we do this. But my point, dear friends, these are simply tools. These are simply tools, but it has to be rooted in the real situation. So the problem is here, and this is what the problem tree. You put the causes here, and you have the effects up there. These are now specific to the problem tree, the fishbone analysis. I'm sure you've heard of this. You know, the problem is there, and these are the base, but you have the trunks, etc. Then, of course, SWOT. You've heard of this. My friends, all I'm saying in the job of a policy analyst is that he or she has some tools to break down the analysis. You just don't look at it in one fell swoop. You have to break it down. You have to break it down to be able to understand. Because many, many times, the problem becomes an error of the third kind. Many, many times, sometimes my daughter is a doctor, okay? And sometimes she tells me, you know, we are treating the symptoms, but not the disease. We are treating the symptoms, but not the disease. What is the disease? What is the root? And that is what the job of the policy analyst is, to help look at the root of the problems. But there are many times that we simplistically look at the problem and say, oh, too many cars, so many cars don't go out, etc. Because what happened, you had a number of cars. Now, another approach that you can use is the why. Just keep on asking, why is this? Why is this? Why is this? Why is there traffic? Too many cars. Why too many cars? Because bad transportation. Why bad transportation? Because maybe we don't have infrastructure, etc. Just keep on asking why. This can also help the policy analyst identify the problem, deepening. So I'm almost done. So that's a why diagram, and of course, very important, as I mentioned, the importance of for whom, the importance of the stakeholders. Who is your stakeholder? Is it the minister? Is it the public? Is it your friend? And as pointed out by the first speaker, you have so many stakeholders, including business. Let's be careful, because the decision maker, the minister, the decision maker, the politician, has so many people to satisfy. And I think that is where she talked about the part where it becomes very, very difficult, and sometimes the person compromises. Our job as policy analysts is to keep focus on the objective, on the goal, and not to be distracted. But as I mentioned, focus that is evidence-based. Sir, madam, these are the numbers. Let us look at the numbers, okay? I'm almost there. So as I mentioned earlier on, we have to make sure that we know for whom our stakeholders. Is it the individual? Is the minister? Analysis? Okay, an indicative look. And this one recently in the Philippines, we had the pandemic, lockdown, economic recovery. This could be really subjects of serious policy analysis. The pandemic, lockdown, you and I, dear Agus, we were involved in this. Should we lock down? Should we open? The crime, is it unemployment? Is it lack of jobs? Why is there unemployment? No jobs and investment. In other words, there can be so many causes. And our job as policy analysts, like the fishbone, is to look at the causes of the causes. Look at the causes of the causes of the causes. So go deeper and deeper and deeper. And the policy analyst has to have that kind of analytical frame based on specific data. It's very, very important. We have the data. You just don't say, oh, it's because of this. No, you should have the data. You should have the evidence. That is your job as policy analysis. In the Philippines, as mentioned, these are just some examples. Now, the reason I'm talking about the Philippines is because in my assignment, you told me to share about the Philippine experience. So right now in Mindanao, we have the so-called Mindanao problem. Is it because is it a military problem, or is it an economic problem? Okay, because it will determine the strategy. I'll not go to this anymore. Of course, we have the problem of red tape, etc. So, dear friends, it's really going deeper and deeper, and that's the job of the policy analyst. Okay, so what are his jobs? I already mentioned this. Many of you are scholars and researchers. You work in teams. Equally important, you have to be able to identify the various problems and identify solutions, propose solutions, and also research is very, very important. Doing research, and this is what I would like to mention. Collecting data, coming up with trends, coming up with projections, but these projections, my friend will talk about borrowing data from the future. collecting data and use statistical data. Okay, so maybe I know it's about 3 more minutes. So the policy analyst, therefore, after having looked at the entire picture, has to come up with these reports and presentations for the minister. But you and I know sometimes that the minister is very busy, so it has done with very, very simple, but equally important, simple, crisp recommendation, simple, crisp causes, if you may, but come up with your preferred recommended solutions towards the ultimate objective of raising public awareness on. Let me end by saying, okay, so should the policy analyst have a bias? For me, yes. For me, yes. Sure, the policy analyst should be able to talk about options from extreme left to extreme right, from very easy to very hard, but at the end of the day, make some recommendations. And for me, the recommendations should be based on what we have called equity and ethics. We published this in the Global Encyclopedia for Public Administration, edited by Dr. Farasman. You might want to look at it. But anyway, in it, we talk about the importance not only of classic traditional efficiency, economy, and effectiveness, but most important, equity and ethics. Equity and ethics. You and I know that the problem of corruption, the problem of accountability is really a problem in many, many countries, including ours. Now, equity, what's equity? Equity is one, focus on the poor, focus on the vulnerable. Not everybody's created equal. So the policy analyst should see, hey, for whom? Maybe it's for these people who are poorer, for those, the vulnerable. And that's very SDG. And equally important, this Greta Thunberg, I really like this girl. She talks about you guys, all of us, my generation. You know, you guys, all you talk about is profit. But you know, remember the next generation. What is going to be the impact of your policy recommendation to the next generation? That is why we have climate change. That is why you have the problem, because the generation ahead of us did not think of that. I think, dear friends, a policy analyst should not think only of the vulnerable, but equally important, the next generation. And that should be factored into your recommendation. But yes, you have a whole slew of options, but I think you should have a recommendation in favor of equity. Okay, but of course, this is something that in public administration governance, you cannot compromise the importance of no corruption, the importance of integrity. I'll end with this. I borrowed this from, I participated in a webinar, of course, by Intan last time. And for me, this was very interesting because they talk about religion and corruption. And at one point, you know, they said, you know, in the Philippines, he said, in the Philippines is a Christian country, but you have so much corruption. And you also talk about Indonesia is a country with Muslims, but you Islam, but also corruption. The point, dear friends, we are painting the picture, but equally important, we should be able to do the analysis. Okay, the only reason I pointed this out is I think it's important that the policy analyst should be able, is it religion? Is it poverty in corruption? Is it religion? Is it poverty? Is it colonialism? I don't know. Okay, so finally, what I tried to do in a span of exactly 20 minutes is one, we have to policy analysis should be located in the field of public administration. Number two, we have the framework from agenda setting to implementation to evaluation. But equally important, there are certain steps. Identify your stakeholders, and there are certain instruments. Remember what we talk about, the problem tree analysis. We talk about the why diagram. You talk about the fishbone. There are certain steps that will help us do the analysis and provide the science. And then I gave you some examples in the Philippines. And of course, I said, hey, the role and duty of the policy analyst, he provides all the options. Extreme left, extreme right, vertical, horizontal, but vertical, horizontal. But equally important, you make the preferred recommendation. Whether the minister listens to you or not, it's now his job. And part of you is to make sure that he listens to you. So with that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, my good friend, Dr. Prasojo, and of course to our colleagues around the table. Terima kasih banyak, Dr. Agus Promosinto, Dr. Eko Prasojo, and my colleagues from the very important webinar. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Professor Alec. Maraming salamat po. Thank you. If Professor Radin talking about the characteristic of policy analysis, yeah, the analytical mind, direct access to the policymaker, and also intuitive capacity. Yeah? So Professor Alec talking more about the substance of policy analysis. Yeah? We have to take attention for values, constitutions, yeah, the interest of society and even also the interest of political parties and politicians, yeah, Professor Alex, yeah, and how to use the tools of policy analysis, yeah, for the policy analysis. It is very interesting, Professor Alex, the complexity of profession of policy analyst with context of the Philippine policy making process, yeah. So that happened also in Indonesia, yeah, with the car, with the so people buy more car, yeah, to avoid the policy implementation in Indonesia. So that very nice. Yeah. Now we are coming to the next speakers, Dr. Adrian Campbell from Birmingham University. With his experience, also his experiments, I think we would learn from him much about the policy analysis. So time is yours, Dr. Adrian Campbell. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prasoja. I'll just share my screen. I hope that's visible to everyone. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking at this event. I'm delighted to see Dr. Professor Brillante, who I think I last met probably more than 10 years ago at the Observatory on Decentralization in Paris, I think it was. And Professor Prasoja, I'm delighted to meet because we use your book on leadership and public sector reform in Asia. What I'd like to do is to, I will be presenting in effect a kind of short case study of the UK about the issue of policy analysis, the policy process, and I will pick up. I think I'll be. I hope that this will fit in with the previous contributions, because, for example, Professor Radin talked about the ambiguity between analysts and advisors, that there are different functions, but in reality they often overlap. Who is an advisor, who is an analyst? And I think if you look at our system, what policy analysis is, there have been many different definitions or functions involved in policy analysis over time, and quite different people can refer to themselves as a policy analyst. And I think that ambiguity is quite important, because it is quite difficult to separate in government. It's quite difficult to separate kind of pure analysis from political advice. And I also, Professor Brillante mentioned that, of course, that national traditions are important, and that a lot of the policy theory has come from outside. And this is true from us also, although we are, I suppose we are in the West. The policy analysis came to us from the United States. It's not a British tradition, and it doesn't quite fit with some British administrative traditions. For example, culturally, we have a distrust of the expert in our system. For example, we had for many years we had what was called the administrative grade of civil servants. They were superior to the expert, to the executive grades. The elite were generalists. They were generals. They were well-educated amateurs. In fact, the idea was they had what was called a first-class brain, and they would be able to make judgments on any topic that happened to arise. Maybe the experts would give them some data, but they would then make the judgment. And the idea was that the civil servant was stood between the information and the politician. They would help the politician to take the results of analysis and turn this into the policy that they wanted. So again, like Professor Brillante said, the idea of values is very central to this. The idea is that these decisions are taken on the basis of values, and objectives, they don't come automatically from the data. Now, that was tradition for many years. That was the culture of our civil service. Of course, times change. I think as technology changes, as society changes, then there's a need for the civil service to become more scientific, and this is in effect what happened. And it started in the 1960s. We had a reform of the civil service in 1966 and began to give more power or more recognition to the role of the analyst and the policy analysis, and a kind of more systematic approach began to come into our civil service practice. But later, I think the challenge to that came not so much from the old administrative tradition, but more from the political advice tradition. The strong players in our system now are the political advisors or special advisors, and they will tend to have more influence than the neutral analyst. And also, I think another aspect, and this is something that Professor Radin mentioned also, is that you've seen the growth of think tanks within government and then outside government, so that the process is partly privatized. So you get policy analysts who are working in institutes outside, not necessarily academics. These are institutes which are part of the policy process, but they are not part of government, but they're close to government. And the connection between them and government is through the politicians. And this creates a much more complicated environment. In some ways, it's good because it provides more of a dynamic than perhaps would come from a system. If you just had policy analysis within government, you don't have this. Having a stimulus from outside, from a political think tank, can be a good thing. Particularly if in times where radical change is needed, that having external think tanks may help to encourage that. Finally, another aspect that I want to draw on is in my background at the beginning was mentioned the interest in the horizontal and vertical. I think the policy analysis or the policy profession has a particular role in providing the horizontal links in government, because government in our country, like in most countries, is still very vertical. People tend to work in vertical silos, and the policy profession is one of the means of connecting the horizontal to provide a kind of horizontal glue or communication across the structure. I'll start with the policy profession, and it's the wording is very careful. This is how they describe the policy. It's now a profession within the civil service. Within reorganization, you now have a policy profession. And what does it do? It designs, develops, and proposes appropriate courses of action to help meet key government priorities and ministerial objectives. It's a very clever piece of wording. That's what they use it on all the documents now, because you can't it means it's not clear where's the initiative coming from. Is it coming from the ministers with their objectives, or is it coming from the policy people who are designing, developing, and proposing courses of action? And of course, it's somewhere in between. It's deliberately, like many things in our system, it's deliberately left slightly ambiguous so that it can allow for different interpretation by different people. The policy profession, there's been a lot of work on this recently, and this comes from the most recent set of standards from the civil service. They like to see it in terms of 3 blocks, what the policy profession is there to do. Partly that's delivery, getting the job done, the implementation. Partly it is the helping the democratic system or the system of governance to function. But the main part, I think the key part for today, for what we're talking about today, is this section, the strategy section, which brings together several things which are quite different. The policy, understanding the policy context, which is a much more generalist skill, to the ability to draw data and scientific advice. So to try and put those together. And here they go into more detail on this, and you can see that basically there are kind of generalist skills, the skills of understanding the context, the political implications, the risks, and so on. On the other hand, the more detailed, the task of data analysis and science. And I think in that there's a sense these two have to work together, but they're different things. And this is the challenge of the policy profession. It has to bring together those different aspects. There's a lot of work has gone into recently trying to professionalize this policy profession by setting out what are the skills, what are the basic skills that any policy professional should know. That's the level one, the developing stage, the practitioner, where they are already able to carry out certain skills. Interesting point here is that they don't expect the policy professional to be skilled in all the different skills. They expect them to be good at some, not others. In other words, they might be good on data and science, or they might be good on the policy context. They don't necessarily have to do both, but they have to understand what they don't know. They have to be able to work with people. And I think behind this is a kind of team thinking, just that people will have different skills in this area, and they will have to work together as a team. And if you look at their advertising, they often emphasize the need for people to have the ability to work in a team with people from other educational backgrounds. And finally, the level three, the expert. Now we have, unlike in our early tradition, the expert is now given a special, for which we recognize people have particular expertise. But this has come quite slowly in our system. Unlike in the US, there wasn't the same respect for a policy analyst. Didn't mean someone who was spent a long time studying a particular area. The policy analyst tends to be someone who can move from one policy question to another and has got certain skills they can transfer. And this is actually, if you look in the research, this Page and Jenkins study was quite good on this. They explain that in the UK, the policy bureaucracy is often involves quite junior people having a fairly flexible task. They're able to move from around different teams. They're basically gluing and linking together different parts of the system in a relatively unstructured way. Now that has certain strength, that allows flexibility in the system. It allows for a certain amount of innovation. It perhaps means that the respect for the data and the science may get lost in the process. So I think that's in our system. There's still there isn't that same respect for the data that you may find in other systems. And you can see that in when they recommend what qualifications should the strategic policy analyst have. And it will tend to be public administration, economics, anthropology, philosophy, psychology. No mention of statistics anywhere there. That's a different route. That's another way. So you're beginning to see it now. You're beginning to see, and I've noticed a trend that people are doing public administration or social science type degrees, and then they're doing a master's in data analysis. And I think that there's a move now that if you want your career to progress, yes, you do the study, you do the kind of basic social science, the public administration, but social policy, but then you do a data analysis. So I think this is actually changing. But until now, the profile for a strategic policy person was very much social science, maybe humanities, social science combination. I just put here just for there's also the analysis function in government, but if you look closely, what this actually refers to, this is statisticians. There's still there's a separation between policy people and analysts. So what is called the analyst's function is not really policy analysis. It's the statistics, data, and so on. There's only certain roles, like the strategic policy analyst. This is one of 30 roles which come in that analysis function, and that is more like what you would call a policy analyst. And it gives the roles there. and a range of skills that they need to have. They need to combine quantitative and qualitative analysis, political awareness, social economic, very broad range of skills they're expected to have. And they are involved at all stages of the process, all stages of that done cycle that Professor Brilliant mentioned. They're basically involved in all stages. There isn't a simple division like they're involved in the development of policy and then they hand it on to someone else. They tend to be involved in getting the policy done. One of the reasons for that is because the vertical system in public administration is very slow to implement things. You can't just pass the decision onto the ministries and expect them to implement it, because they won't. Somebody has to take it to them and make them do it. One of our prime ministers, Tony Blair, who was a very good speaker, a very clever lawyer, but it was said after he retired, they said he had never understood how government worked. He thought that if you say we're going to do this, that it'll be done. He had no idea that no, that's only the beginning. And so this is where the policy profession comes in. Yeah, I just gave an example here. This is there's a lot of movement of policy people around government at the moment, particularly with so many different areas of urgent crisis. And this one, for example, a supply chains unit, the capital, 6 months, they take someone for 6 months and put them into a team to move very fast, working on this supply chains problem that we have as a number of countries currently have. And the unit brings together various teams for cross-Whitehall coordination, means coordination across the different ministries, bringing together policy strategy, different stakeholders, and so on. And this is an example, I think, of how policy analysts are used not just to analyze, but to actually help to make things happen, to bring to get different governmental actors involved and get them to actually start implementing. I think what you can see here is that the division between policy formulation and implementation becomes very blurred, that they're getting the implementation process ready even as they formulate the policy. So to summarize, then you say there are three types of policy analysts that you could broadly talk about. You said there are the kind of basic ones that inside the sectoral ministries, inside it, people are just doing internal policy analysis, like on housing or health or police or whatever. They're actually doing, and that would tend to be more data-based. Then you have policy analysts who are more about coordination within central government or also within local governments, as I will come on to in a moment. But what they're doing is not so much getting data; they're more about getting people to collaborate in developing and implementing policy. And the third type is in the think tanks, and think tanks are so in government and also outside government, and they're connected to government in different ways. And I just noticed here, this is an advertisement for policy analysts, and it makes very similar categories. Where if you're a policy analyst, where will you end up working? You might be local central government, you might be think tanks or NGOs, or you might be inside particular organizations in the public and private sector working on their specific problems. The policy units, it's worth a mention, because I think it actually was probably developed better and earlier in local government than it has been in central government. If you go back to the 1970s, they created larger local government units, and these units had a chief executive, a stronger role for a chief executive, and they wanted kind of corporate management, to have a more coherent, more strategic management. And the way they set about achieving this was to have policy units. So analysts, people with a kind of analytical and process understanding, quite small numbers of people, but in a very strategic position next to the chief executive. And they would really be there to try to extend the chief executive's authority with the functional departments. And they would promote cross-departmental strategic initiatives, which would often be ignored by departments. So someone had to go and try to get them to implement what they were supposed to implement. One of them actually told me at the time, rather nice. They said that there are two ways of getting a department. You can have two approaches. If you go to a department and you want them to carry out this corporate strategy, you can either be the friendly mechanic who helps them to get things going, or you can be like the secret police who goes there to find out that they're not doing what they're supposed to do and to report them. And of course, they said that the friendly mechanic was much more effective. They said, if you try to make yourself useful to the department, they were more likely to accept what you're recommending. But I think that the key point is that they were the link between, you have the chief executive, you have a kind of overall strategy, and then you have departments which each have their own concerns, their own focus, and how to get them to work on for the corporate goals. Just a brief summary of think tanks. These appeared in our central government, right in the center of government in the early 70s, and they were there just quite small, but the idea was that they would bring together academics, civil servants, and business analysts to help to promote cohesion in government. And they worked for governments of different parties, and they were abolished then by Mrs. Thatcher when she was Prime Minister. An interesting question, why did she abolish them? And there's a very nice quote there that she said, well, these policy analysts were basically set up, they were there when there were fewer think tanks outside, there were fewer other sources of information. And if a government has a firm philosophical direction, it was, and I think she said she obviously saw the technocratic policy analysts as an obstacle, that she wanted more engaged analysts. Now, whether that's right or not is a matter of opinion. But there's also an interesting point in that she actually had herself founded a think tank outside government called the Centre for Policy Studies, and they became the leading, at that time, the leading input of, in terms of policy analysis for government, because the government had a very clear agenda, and they had a think tank which spoke directly to that agenda. And that model has tended to grow since. And this is a model imported, I think, first from the USA, also from Germany, the sort of foundations idea. And you now have quite a large number of think tanks which have either ideological leanings, or they have particular focus in particular sectors. And this is where a lot of the policy analysis is carried out. And sometimes people criticize it. They say these think tanks become too powerful. They are setting the agenda too much from outside the government, maybe using some politicians within government, but there needs to be more of an independent analysis within government to balance the influence of these think tanks. Although, of course, the think tanks, what they can say, well, this is actually an achievement because they actually are setting the agenda. They have a number of policies have come because they've been promoted by the think tanks. And if you agree with those policies, then you'll say, well, this was an achievement. They made analysis, they promoted it in their research, and on the basis of that research caught the attention of government and was then implemented. And you also have you have a policy unit at Downing Street at the Prime Minister's office, and there were attempts to abolish this. There was a fear this was too much, trying to exercise too much control, having a policy unit to control ministries. But interestingly, the Prime Minister who abolished it then created another one to replace it a year later, because he found that it was actually very useful to have a policy unit of analysts and experts at the center of government to promote coherence and coordination with ministries. Finally, we had in the meantime, the people who grew in influence, apart from the external think tanks, the other growth in influence was these special advisors. And these are people who combined the kind of analysis role with political advice. And they were usually people appointed by ministers. there were probably only about 130 of them, but they have very big advice, a very big influence across government, and this led to some there's some disagreements, and I think the most striking example was Dominic Cummings, who became he was very much the main power behind our current Prime Minister, although he had to resign last year. But it's interesting, he was trying to change the civil service. He didn't like the analysis that the civil service did. He wanted to have a much more adventurous, much more radical, and he said, we need to hire completely different people. We need to get rid of the civil servants, get rid of the generalists, get rid of the traditional analysts, and go for basically hiring people in these categories. And the most extraordinary one that was commented on was that he asked for weirdos and misfits with odd skills, because his view was that people with a traditional training could not understand complex, could not come up with innovative solutions. And he was at the time he was trying to start a very large, very major reform of the civil service. Fortunately for the civil service, he got into some problems and had to resign, and he's no longer in a leading position. And when he went, there was a former minister wrote an article very critical of the Cummings approach, and saying that this was really this would be leading to a kind of this emphasis on data and algorithms and kind of communications was going to lead to a technocratic, kind of populist technocratic government, a combination of populism and technocratic government, which would be, I think the idea is being, this is against the tradition of a more pragmatic, a combination of administrative and political expertise, and in a sense, Cummings is trying to go around that. However, I think that what that shows is that in conclusion, I would say that there are still a number of changes have happened, which obviously challenge the existing way of doing policy analysis. To summarize, I would say in the UK, you tend to have a distinction. You have generalist policy professionals who are skilled in looking at the process, and you have specialist policy analysts who are skilled in collecting, interpreting data. Now, in the long run, these two groups should overlap and merge, but I think we're still in the early stages of that. There are still two clearly different sets of skill there, different people involved. I think the view is that they should become closer together. The advance of technology is eroding this distinction, so you're beginning to see hybrid careers of generalists and experts, and this may lead to a kind of more technocratic government. Not that technocratic is necessarily a bad thing, but it could, if you could have a more technocratic government, government may lose touch with the traditional political and administrative methods. But the generalist policy profession provides, through the formal policy teams, you have a lot of policy teams, as I've said, on different issues, and you have informal policy networks. These provide a horizontal link across the system, which otherwise has rather these vertical, what we call vertical silo structures. The policy profession is one of the main ways of coordinating across that. They also bridge the divide between policy and implementation, because there's many problems have occurred because of policies which were developed without thinking through the implementation effects, and they're trying, by bridging that, the policy profession is able to make policies which can be implemented more effectively. So, but overall, I'd say that national traditions are still have an influence, and the UK, the policy analyst profession is probably much more fluid, much more ambiguous, which is very much in line with the generalist traditions of the UK civil service. It doesn't really have that kind of clear professional scientific orientation. There are scientists, there are professionals in that, but generally the policy profession is still a very broad set of skills. And this is very much part of tradition and the way that the institutions work. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adrian Campbell. Very interesting and insightful presentation from you. I think we learned so much about the development of profession of policy analyst in UK. You talk also about the competency should be developed for policy analysts, yeah? Strategy, democracy, and also delivery is very interesting. And also development of policy unit in the central government and also in the local governments. Yeah, you talk about the supply chain unit in the cabinet, but also policy unit in the local governments. And I think it is very interesting because you talk about how the policy process among the ministries, between the central and also local governments, and also between the government and also the society. Yeah? This is very interesting topic to be discussed more. Yeah. Now we are coming to the discussion session. Yeah, I think, and I see we have already many questions in the Q&A box. Yeah. Maybe we can take 3 questions first, and will be discussed from the perspective of speakers. Yeah. First is from Pak Haris Fauzan from the National Institute of Public Administration. The question is, what are the main capacities, yeah, that a policy analyst must have in order to be able to formulate a good policy brief? Yeah. The second is based on the experience on the countries of the speakers. Yeah. How do policy analysts from the government agencies optimize the public policy formulation process? What are the important contributions that the policy analyst has made? This is the first questions from Pak Haris Fauzan. Yeah. Okay. The next special questions for Professor Alex Brilliante. What policy recommendation or about what have you formulated and accommodated as public policy in the Philippines? Yeah. So the next question, please. I think from Pak Hari Supriyadi. How to maintain the quality standard, the standard quality of work of a policy analyst when pragmatic political agenda is very strong. For example, when it is against the efficiency, fairness, or just policy principle. Yeah. Okay. If the advisor versus policy analysis clearly distinguished, then the above question is answered as long as the advisor taking the bridging process. Yeah. So I think the quality, the standard of quality of policy analysis, yeah, against the political agenda that is very dynamic, yeah, considering the political interests of the politician and also the political parties. Yeah. Next, the third questions, the last question for the first term. I think from Ibu Emma Erwanti from the Ministry of Mining. Yeah. Okay, how the government in the Philippines optimizes the role and influence of the policy analysts in the ministries. I think the question is not only to Professor Alex, but also to Dr. Adrian Campbell. Yeah, maybe there are 3 questions to be discussed. Yeah, I would like to give the time to Professor Alex Brilliante to give comments for the questions. Yeah. Please, Professor Alex.
Terima kasih, Professor Eko. Those are very provocative questions, but maybe I'll take off from, if you don't mind, I think I can link this to the presentation, Professor Adrian, when you talk about Cummings. Professor Adrian, you're there, right? And
Yeah,
if you recall, for me that was very interesting when you said that Cummings came in, and then he wanted to change the entire bureaucracy. Essentially, you know, it's so romantic. But the thing is, we have to recognize the power of the bureaucracy. I've seen that, no, people coming in to come and save the bureaucracy, but at the end of the day, the bureaucracy is so powerful that, you know, politicians come and go, but the bureaucracy remains. Point, and I'll go to the, and this will go to the first question. We have to be somehow quite realistic in that sense, Dr. Harris. So we have to be realistic, but it's equally important that even as you're realistic, you provide several options from left to right. But at the end of the day, you make your own contribution. That's why for me, you mentioned some think tanks, right? Dr. Adrian, and I know even in the US, there are all kinds of think tanks from left to right. And sometimes when you're labeled ideologically, I once worked with what's called the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., you know, and as you know, that is quite a radical, and they say, or if you, let's say you are from, at one point when I was in Washington, I worked across, I forget now what, the Brookings Institution. These are all think tanks. But once you are labeled for your ideological link, I think that's a strength, but it can also be a weakness. Because in the real world, as you pointed out, in the real world, your politicians who will choose to implement what they want because they're talking about their survival, they're talking about their own political careers. So I think a policy analyst should, one, be able to provide the options, but hey, at the end of the day, this is my recommendation. And be realistic that maybe, Mr. Minister, maybe you will not accept this, that's fine. But I did my job as a policy analyst. And in the Philippines, that's exactly what we did. I was once with the Ministry of Local Government. But before that, I was, I'm really an academic, but at one point I became a practitioner in government. And when we were outside, we were pushing for because that was a question of Harris. We were pushing for decentralization. And, you know, why this? But when we went into government, we were able to come up with what we call now our local government code. Indonesia, you had your code in 2000, year 2000, right? We had ours in 1991. Many mistakes. But at the end of the day, one has to recognize, one has to be realistic. You know, we had some kinds of nice, very nice timelines, but that's not the way the real world works. When you are in the bureaucracy, you find out that it's not that easy because there's so many competing factors out there. Because, hey, the minister has also to fight for his survival. And of course, ministers change. And you're there. But your job as a policy analyst, at least you provided options, and maybe it can happen. Your recommendation might happen. So we're talking about our decentralization policy in the 1990s. It's what, 30 years later, we're still moving in that direction. Okay? But look at the ultimate objective of decentralization. It is empowerment. I know in Indonesia, in the Philippines, we've pushed the envelope and we're even pushing for federalism, of course. But because at the end of the day, what is at the core? It's all about empowerment. How do you package this? How do you package it so it will not look so radical? And I think as policy analysts, we should also be able to recognize the quote unquote the agenda of our political agenda of our principles, I think. But our job, we provide the whole options. I think that's part of it. But the options should be, as Dr. Eco also mentioned, and our first speaker mentioned, the importance of, you mentioned the importance of statistics. I think that's very important. But equally important, we have to be aware, statistics can be manipulated. And that is where now the policy analyst will be able to say, hey, wait a minute, you have selected. So I would not be so romanticized about being impressed by these statistics. We always have, the policy analyst should always look at the question behind the question. Question behind the question. And even challenge this. But yes, it's a very exciting profession, if you may. But I think at the end of the day, the question is for whom? That's why I said earlier, it might not be good. It might not be in accordance to standard theory policy analysis. But for us in the third world, I think, hey guys, for whom? It is for the disadvantaged. It is for, we talk about equity, next generation. because we're now suffering. Right now, we're suffering from the mistakes from very nice policies before. But hey, what's going on? Climate change. What's going on? Because these were policies done by very, very good technocrats who were so brainy. They studied in the US with their fancy PhDs. They came back. We did that. And where are we today? So I think you should be grounded also in the for whom question. And I think we're in the same boat as far as Indonesia is concerned. Sorry, I talked too long, but thank you for that question, Dr. Harris, Professor Harris. And I'll shut up after this because Emma mentioned we have many think tanks in the Philippines also. The think tanks, and yes, we have we call the Philippine Institute for Policy Studies, Philippine Institute for Development Studies. We have think tanks, but I think it's very, very important. That's in government, so it is really related to what they want. We don't have as many ideological think tanks as they have, let's say in the US or even in UK, because they do. But sometimes once you're branded, that's your strength, but that's also your weakness. Thank you very much. Terima kasih, Professor Eko.
Thank you, Professor Alex. Yeah, we can conclude that policy analysis is intellectual activities in political process. Yeah. So as analysts, we have to write the high call recommendation, high call policy brief, policy papers in the perspective of academics. Yeah. But indeed, we have also political interest in the policy making process. So this is about how we can convince the policymaker with the spatial political interest in the intellectual platform. It is very interesting, I think. I would like to invite Dr. Adrian to give comments, how we as a policy analyst could convince the policymaker, the policymaker in considering the political interest that they have actually in the policy making process. Please, time is yours, Dr. Adrian.
Yes, yes. I think the interesting thing here is incentives. What I think, I mean, in a sense, what the policy analyst ideally can do is that they can bring information in to prevent the government becoming a closed system, which has already decided what the facts are, what's to be done about it. And I think the way to do it is to I think the way to do it is to find more information, and the information to show the risks of getting the policy wrong. That if and this may take some time, because people often, once a policy is decided or once the general direction is decided, there's very little incentive for a politician to accept any data that goes against that. So I think it is. I think it's quite important to find the data which show the risks, to the risks in the policy. We used to have we've had a number of comedies about the civil service over the years, and one of them there was where the civil servant says to the minister suggests something which is actually not a good idea, and rather than say you're wrong, the civil servant says, "That's a very brave policy, minister." I said, "Why is it brave?" And he said, "Well, because," and then he says what the consequences should be. I think one of the problems, I think this Professor Brilliant mentioned this, so one of the problems we've had, I think, in recent years is the way that the policy analysis has been politicized. It's been one of the products of the growth in think tanks has been that the information has become politicized. So people are researching to support a policy which they already support. They're just looking for material to confirm it. And I think this is dangerous, because it means, my personal view is that in the 30 years or so in which the civil service has become increasingly politicized in our country, I would say you can see more badly thought out decisions are being taken. In the past, we might have rather slow or not very effective decisions taken, but they were not usually completely wrong. Whereas in the last 20, 30 years, there have been quite a number of cases where the politicians have literally imposed a solution which in the past the civil service or analysts would have made some objection to. And I think what has happened is that they need to observe Machiavelli's recommendation that the leader should always have someone there who will tell them the truth. Not all the time, but when they're asked, when asked the question, they will tell the truth. And unfortunately, in the last 25, 30 years, because there's been greater pressure on the civil service from politicians, because they've been producing more of their own research, their own setting their own agenda, and so on, there hasn't the contrary voice has. Obviously, there's an opposition which says it, but from those who work for them, there isn't that voice coming to say maybe this is not a good idea. And because of that, we've had a number of quite serious policy miscalculations as a result of that. So I'm not sure that there's a simple answer. I think probably the optimal position is that you want to avoid the system being captured. You don't want it captured by a closed bureaucracy, and you don't want it captured by politicians who don't have sufficient limitations on their power. So, and I think the only way around that is to have a strong neutral capacity for research within the civil service, which researches things on a routine basis, not just when they're told to do it for a particular policy, and to have a strong civil society of research institutes around government, so that assumptions are questioned, so that ideas don't just take root. It is very difficult once a minister or has we placed a lot of hope in this idea of evidence-based policy, which you would think would be common sense. Of course, policy should be evidence-based. It is actually very difficult to even decide what counts as evidence, whose evidence, and so on. I think a stronger policy analysis function would help to remedy that. Too often the ministers will see some very specific piece of evidence which supports their policy, and they stay with that, and it can be years before you actually can then show that evidence was wrong. We've had this in a number of policy areas, and these are things which could easily have been researched if someone actually had the incentive to do so.
Thank you, Dr. Adrian. So the function of policy analysis is to show the risk to the policymaker, when the policy get wrong. This is the conclusion, And I think.
Could I just add to that? When we had the policy unit in the Prime Minister's office, that was actually it was given their task. It was the idea was that they would look at policies and they would see a disaster before it happened, so that the idea is they actually had it was their job to look at policies, to look at the risks, and bring those to the attention of the politicians before it became a problem.
Yeah. Okay. This is, I think, very justified. The policy analyst function. To show the government before they make policy. The maybe unintended effect or maybe the risk that came up after the policy being implemented. Thank you very much, Dr. Adrian. Very insightful comments from you. Maybe we could come to another questions. Could you please, Emma, already? Okay, next question. Okay, from Rustan, from the National Institute of Public administration. According to your experience, how to bring together the thoughts of policy analysts in formulating a policy recommendation, and how to align political interests with the policy recommendation presented. I think this is some of answer have been explained by Dr. Adrian and also Dr. Alex. Next, I think, from Imade Bram Sarjana, I observed there is a kind of ignorance of expertise and science during the pandemic. Some world leaders in the early stages of this pandemic even do not believe in COVID-19 or the importance of vaccination to contain the virus. How do you see the role of policy analysts to ensure that policymakers base their judgment on science and to ensure the scientific judgment will be politically and socially acceptable? This is very important questions considering the pandemic 19 that happened now. How the role of policy analysts to convince the policymakers on the impact of pandemic, and to propose the option, the best option to the government. Professor Alex and Dr. Adrian, maybe you have a comment, please.
Yeah, well, that's a very important question. You know what? I think the most important asset of any policy or a think tank, if you may, is really the integrity. Because as also pointed out by Dr. Adrian earlier, it's entirely possible that you are quote unquote hired as an expert, hired as an analyst, and they selectively use the data. And once you as a, even as a consultant, let's face it, guys, you as a consultant, once you have had that kind of reputation, then your integrity is very, very important. That's why I always say that, you have to be able to provide all sides. I think it's very, very important because once you have been labeled as such, I mean, there goes your integrity. And hey, this is a hack, this is a person for sale. And using his or her skills as an analyst to justify certain things. And I think that's quite difficult. But that's at one level, those who work with what is, and you are so right about those in the pandemic. You recall what happened, I think the best example, and I think you're referring to the United States here. That's exactly what happened when they have lost their, when the politicians just ram what they want, and then they want the scientists, if you may, to justify what they're doing. I mean, that okay, provide everything, then maybe go to the, I guess, word of public opinion. I think that's very, very important. But listen, I think you are so right about the fact that maybe at one point some quote unquote analysts might be in danger of compromising, and I think that's a very, very dangerous. So I think, as I go back earlier, integrity is very important. Honestly, providing options. Remember, we said earlier the job of the analyst, is still to provide options from left to right. It can be very bad, it can be very good, and then come up with your recommendation. Integrity, honesty, and hey, sir, Mr. Minister, this is what the data says. And as pointed out by Dr. Adrian earlier, you should always, a leader should have someone who will always tell the truth. But you are so right. What if the leader chooses his own truth? I mean, that's a big problem. If the truth of the leader is something that he wants to believe, we're in big trouble now. See? And you and I know that there are leaders around the world who are like that. See, so do we go to the world of public opinion? And they write about civil society coming in. The Philippines, we have a very, very good think tank that's out of our university. It's called Octa Research. Okay, and they were very, very careful. Some of them are from very, very careful about their data not being used or misused or misread or utilized. Because the moment that happens, there goes your integrity. It's very, very important, I think, as far as that's concerned. So right now, Octa Research, as far as the pandemic is concerned, is being cited by some, but of course, those who do not believe in that, they in fact brought them to Congress and had them investigated. But my colleagues in the university were able to stand it. So there are some dangers there. But I think the most important is your integrity. So they'll believe in you.
Thanks, Professor Alex. I see also the impact of pandemic to the policy making process. The normal process of policy making do not fit anymore. Because the government is competing with the times to make policy in the short term. responding on dealing with the pandemic. And I see also in Indonesia, some expert in economy and also in the public health have been also integrated directly to the policy making process in the governments. Yeah. And even the spokesman of the national ad hoc committee for COVID-19 is also a professor from the university to explain daily policy making process, policy option made by the governments. So this is the new normal of policy making process, where the expertise could be also integrated directly into the policy making process in the governments. Since the COVID is very dangerous, need urgent policy and so on. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Alex. I would like to ask Dr. Adrian for comments, please.
It's quite, I mean, the pandemic is a very interesting case for a lot of reasons. One of them, I think, is that it was surprising how badly many countries reacted, and for how ineffectively the systems of policy that were seen as relatively effective didn't they didn't react very effectively at the time, and one wonders why. And I think one of the reasons is that people have been warning about the risks of a pandemic, and this kind of research is being done, but no one ever had the strong enough incentive to act on that. And so many countries, when the pandemic struck, they were they were like amateurs. They had no training, no understanding of what to do. I think the other thing that's surprising about it is stranger how in a kind of globalized world, policy transfer is still very slow. That, for example, on mask wearing, it was obvious that if you could see the countries where mask wearing was imposed tended to have lower rates of infection, and yet other countries, they had debates about this for months, even for years, as if it was not known, and doing all kinds of research. I think on masks, research comes out regularly. One survey says it makes a difference, the other one says it doesn't, then one says it does, and unfortunately, the science doesn't always speak with one voice. You can often find research, but which says you can find contradictory findings. But it was clear if you compare with policies, if they'd looked at policies being followed in other countries, they would have taken that on board. There's a surprising resistance of many countries to actually borrow from, to learn from experience of from elsewhere in the world. So and I think the other aspect which was striking is that they often have quite a short term in reacting, had a quite short term set of objectives, like the aim was to stop people panicking, or the aim was to stop the hospitals filling up, but it wasn't actually to resolve the crisis. It was more about trying to cope with some particular aspects of it. So I think there are several weaknesses, I think, came out unexpectedly during the pandemic.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, Professor, please.
This thing about mask, it's really something that perplexes, at least for me, in the third world, right? And it becomes a big debate in the US, no? Even vaccines. Like, I think that shows, I guess, you made almost the distrust of government, and also perhaps the quote unquote, for lack of better word, the culture, I guess, of the people. Hey, just wear a mask, period, end of story. But no, I mean, what's going on? Vaccines, because they don't trust their government. Because at one point it was also reinforced by your quote unquote politicians up there, right? So you're sorry about the fact that sometimes they choose what to believe. So, yeah. I don't know, Echo, from your perspective, let's say in Indonesia, right? And then we look at, I don't want to bifurcate, but we look at the behavior sometimes in advanced countries. I mean, why do you have to debate about wearing masks? Everybody knows that that can cause. I mean, if you've been to Japan, you and I, we've been to Japan many, many times. Remember, 5-6 years ago, Japanese go out, and if they have a flu, they all wear masks. That's the most natural thing. I mean, you know, right during winter, and that was pre-pandemic, and that's most accepted. But I wonder why in other countries, why do we even have to debate about that thing? You know. But of course, of course, I'm not criticizing them, but maybe it's a tradition of individualism, freedom, perhaps, and equally important. I think the biggest damage, it was politicized, yeah, because the leader said, "Hey, I don't." Donald Trump said he didn't want them to panic, and that's why there was a bashing of the science, Fauci, etc. But at the end of the day, it's your, I guess, your cultural infrastructure, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know. I saw some of our participants also right now echo wearing masks. In the Philippines, we still wear masks. In fact, more than that. But anyway, I'm not saying we're right. I'm not saying we're wrong. But you know.
Yeah, I think we do also in Indonesia, Alex. I think 95% people wearing the mask. Yeah. Okay. It is very interesting talking about the policy transfer. Yeah. Dr. Adrian said that policy transfer is very slow. So we could not learn from other countries, yeah, to our own countries. I would say that the public management capacity is also very important, yeah, to make sure to socialize, to raise the awareness of the citizens, yeah, wearing the mask during COVID. So public policy always related to the public management capacity of the bureaucracy, and also the relation between the central, provincial, and also local governments here in Indonesia. This is the problem. So the content and the substance of policy recommendation is not the only one, the factor that influence the successful of policy, but also the policy implementation influenced by the capacity of public management in respective countries. Yeah. So how do you mention based on your experiment in your country, Dr. Adrian and Professor Alex, about the policy management in implementing policy, public policy? Yeah?
Well, in the UK, the interesting thing was that the vaccination program went very well. Whereas the initial response in terms of protective clothes and so on was very weak, and the answer was that the initial response, it was very centralized, and it was working through private partners who had not really been very experienced in this area. It was a very odd setup. They took a lot of decisions very quickly, gave a lot of functions to private agencies, and this didn't work well. With the vaccination, it was, I think it was two things. The one is they had the research going on in the background, so they said there was the technical base was there, but the key thing was that they used the local doctors. They used local doctors' clinics as the basis to carry it out. So they used a ready-made implementation network. So that, yes, that made a big, and that's really turned the corner, because until then the handling of the pandemic had been a disaster. From then on, from January this year, then they began to improve. So I think, yes, having the, I think the key point then is to have the infrastructure, public management infrastructure, but also to recognise that you have it, to use the resources that are actually there. When they did that, when they used the local resources, it was much more successful.
Thanks so much, Dr. Adrian. Yeah, so you are also collaborating with private sector, yeah, the third sector, yeah, in vaccination program and so on.
That's true. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So in Indonesia, we are using military and also intelligence unit and police, yeah, to accelerate the vaccination program from the government. So, but we also rely on the local governments, yeah, in the program. Yeah. Professor Alex, do you have any comments?
Very, very quick. One is, I think the pandemic has really revealed really not the strengths, but the weaknesses of our institutions. I think it's very, very important. Global inability to cope with this. Great countries such as the UK, you yourselves, no? So in one sense, it has really showed the weaknesses of the institution, but equally important, the continuing distrust. Government has really lost out a lot of this. People don't trust government these days, no? But equally important, after having said that, national-local relations. In the Philippines, we have a lot of conflict. National government says this, local government says this. No, local government steps up against to national law. And I think Dr. Eco, we've been in a number of seminars on this, on the fact that at the end of the day, locals, not to romanticize them, but locals know the situation, and sometimes national government just is so busy imposing without knowledge of what's going on. I think there has to be a healthy respect of local, but we're not romanticizing them. What's important though is the capacities of locals are there. And finally, communication, as you also mentioned. Communication is very, very important. Continuous communication. Dr. Adrian talked about vertical, and I like what you said, the importance also of horizontal, flattening, because you said about the silos, and that's maybe where civil society policy analysts should come in. This horizontal communication to break the distrust. And that goes back to the topic of today's session. What is the role of the policy analyst? I think one has to be quite broad-minded, if you may, no? And always look at the question behind the question, checking and counter-checking, just accepting things for what they are. And that's our job. Hey, that's why you're trained. That's why you're trained to do research. And then come up with a whole range of options and then say, we think this is the best. What will be, quote, not really practical, I would not even say pragmatic, but that is what public administration are about, the praxis, because you can have the ideal total lockdown, but hey, it's not really that way. One has to be quite practical. So you come up with the praxis of maybe partially lockdown, that kind of thing. And the policy analyst, our topic for today, has to provide such options. That's why we talk about your whole who will lose out, who will win in the end. But sometimes if you're a very, very strong leader who says this is the way it should be done, well, do we stand up to that? At least at the end of the day, integrity. Sir, madam, I told you this, you bear the consequences. Next elections, perhaps. But of course, if people have died, that's very sad.
Thank you, Professor Alex. Do you still have times, maybe 10 minutes before we closing? I think there are some questions to be answered in a chat box. I put one question, for example, in Indonesia, there are a lot of ministries that have mandate for policy making. In fact, every ministry has mandate for their own policies, sectoral policies. So the problem is that in most cases, there are some conflicting policies among the ministry and also with local governments. Do you have best practices to tell us in your country regarding these issues? This is the coordination policy making process. Dr. Adrian mentioned also the general professional of policy analysis in the coordinations of policy making process. Maybe you could share a bit about your best practices, Dr. Adrian and Professor Alex. This is classic problem in the policy making process, coordination among the ministries.
Of course. Dr. Adrian, first up, you go ahead.
I think every country has this to some extent. I'm certainly aware that in Indonesia you have a lot of ministries. So there's which is a kind of pluralism, I suppose. It's a policy pluralism, which and there's a good aspect to that. I mean, obviously, I'm reminded of there was an American policy analyst, a theorist, who wrote that it was good to have redundant institutions, meaning that if you have more ministries, although it can be messy, the fact it means that there are different. Nobody has a monopoly. It's possible to get different views or different policy options can be transmitted because there are more actors in the system. But yes, obviously coordinating it can be quite difficult. It's something which it comes back to what I was saying, which we had in local government, this idea of corporate management, which I think generally I would say has been more successful locally than it has in central government. In central government, there has been the growth of the cabinet office and also the policy unit and other units around the Prime Minister's office and the cabinet office, and also we have a very strong role of the Treasury, the kind of the finance ministry, which has a kind of coordinating role, and those three, the Prime Minister's office, the cabinet office, and the Treasury, between them, they exercise a kind of coordinating role. And in fact, they are actually moving closer together because those three are becoming much more I think there's always a dilemma in government. You want to have a bit of competition. You don't want anyone to have you don't want a complete monopoly of complete centralizing of control. So it's good that there are some different actors at the center, but it's also good if there's some overlap between them. But generally, yes, there's an increasingly, we had a phrase where we called it joined up government. It didn't always work, but the idea was you would try to actually make sure that the same principles were working through different ministries, because yes, each ministry has its own policies, its own particular contribution, its own particular targets, and so on. But the idea is that these should somehow work and reinforce each other. One of the things that needs to be done is to have a media which is focused on this kind of governmental issues. Often the media are not interested in civil service policy unless it's a scandal or something. But where you can actually have a media which follows and points out, saying, this ministry is doing this and this ministry is doing the opposite, and this means a kind of contradictory policy. It's good to draw attention to that, because I think only by drawing attention to things do things actually become solved. So I would say yes, more central coordination, but without giving it to any one body to control everything, and then more information, more interest in the media to pick up, on where ministries need to coordinate better. And I think that you will never eliminate the problem completely, but I think that would help. I think the other thing is to promote team working across ministerial boundaries. So to encourage, again, a kind of professional collaboration, policy analysts within different ministries, to encourage perhaps people to move in their careers between different ministries, so that they know each other and they can collaborate. And that can help to have more kind of policy cohesion.
Thanks so much, Dr. Adrian. Before I give time to Professor Alex, so we have two cases here in Indonesia. In 2020, the government enacted so-called omnibus law, including more than 70 laws, in order to open the climate for investment and so on. This is the way that Indonesian governments made for harmonized, coherence policy and so on. But last month, the Constitutional Court has canceled this law. Has canceled this law. I think this is the problem that we are facing now. This is the first cases. But the second case is that we have that the government normally have a special coordination unit. For example, for poverty alleviation, we have a National Committee for Poverty Alleviation coordinated by the Vice President. So involving more than, I think, 16 ministries with more 65 programs and 128 activities. So but what happened is, I think this is not yet actively coordinated, because every ministries have their own program activities. They don't have any joint outcome or joint impact in the poverty alleviations. They talk in their own ministry's mandate and so on. This is the cases of Indonesia. Professor Alex?
Yeah, in fact, I was because Dr. Adrian showed you the book that you published, and that's exactly the whole point. Leadership is very, very important here. I mean, sure, you have the coordination. They talk about good and best practices, okay? In the Philippines, we have what called the Interagency Task Force, the Development Budget Coordinating. Yeah, but at the end of the day, coordination is almost an oxymoron in government, yeah? Because at the end of the day, who coordinates whom? That is why you have the leadership. That is why even higher, are we moving towards our common goal? Our common, you're talking about SDG, for instance. You're talking about your long-range development plan that should cut across administrations. And sometimes that's a problem in government because when you have a new administration, they come up with their own plans. How to bring in that kind of mindset that at the end of the day, it's the bureaucracy. That's why I like your example about how the bureaucracy almost resisted Cummings, because it's really a recognition that the bureaucracy is not the bureaucracy can be your ally. They're not your enemies. They provide continuity, stability, and that should be recognized by the leadership. Because you and I know that sometimes when the leader comes, they come in to save the world, and then when they go, things go back again. So leadership important, but equally important, how do you institutionalize these coordinating mechanisms? As you know, there's this notion called adhocracy. You get from different ministries, and it's a task force. But at the end of the day, do they evolve into a specific institutional? Well, it depends on the purpose. The Philippines, we have what we call the Interagency Task Force. They work well, but certainly they've had a lot of boo-boos too. Because, but will they eventually become permanent? Maybe because of the pandemic. Hey, all of us just woke up to the fact that maybe it just hit us in the. So it's really something that should be quote unquote institutional. But at the end of the day, policy analysts should be able to align this to our North Star, if you may. It sounds romantic. What's our North Star? Our SDG. What's our North Star? Our long-term development plan. Governments might come and go, but are we aligned to that? And that's the job of Mr. or Miss Policy Analyst. But of course, the analyst should also point out the risks, right? And that's very, very important. As you said, maybe the job of the policy analyst is what you mentioned about the person Machiavelli mentioned, somebody who will always tell the minister, you know what, Mr. Minister, it's about someone who will always tell the truth. That is our job. Let's tell them the truth. Because you and I know that, for lack of better, there are some paid hacks out there. I mean, talk is cheap, analysis is cheap. You have so many bloggers out there. You have so many, but the value, if you may, is your integrity that you cannot be bought. I think that's very, very important. You and I know that we have consultants from left to right. I mean, all of us have been consultants at one point. And sometimes the job of the consultant is to, I've met some people here, and I'll shut up after this. The person says, okay, you're a consultant, you're paid time. This is my conclusion. Now provide the data for such. I mean, come on. Hey, you're going to be paid high, but will you do that? Some do that. I know, because I've had a friend who was a minister at one point. It said, no way. And we have had our own experiences. So at the end of the day, it's your own North Star within you, aligned to your own values, principles. And for me, a policy analyst can be independent only up to a certain point, but soon you have to make your recommendation, whether you accept it or not. That's why you have to become an activist also. You have to become an activist, I think. For me, that is my own, because as you know, in the science of policy science, you have to be neutral, you have to prevent, But for me, at least in our case, you have to stand up and say, equity. For whom? For whom? Equity. For the next generation. Equity. For the vulnerable. That's why we're in government. That's why we're... Okay, that for me is the job of the policy. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you.
I get passionate when we talk about this, my friend.
We have 5 minutes, I think, yeah. I have last question actually. So currently we do research on strategic management, yeah, with Evan Berman and some colleagues from Brazil, from US, yeah. So my finding is that strategic management in central government is okay, is already set up, but the problem in the centralized government like Indonesia is how this policy and strategic management in central government could be effectively implemented in the provincial and in the local governments level. Yeah. So this is a problem of intergovernmental relation, concern of Dr. Adrian. Yeah. How the policy could be also involve the provincial, also local governments. So, do you have any experience in UK and also in the Philippines? How to make connections between policy in central and also the implementation in provincial and local governments? So, thanks for the last question.
Yeah, we have this. It's slightly ambiguous. We have this the system of what's called planning guidance, which means that the ministry will say to a particular area, we think you ought to be building another 500 houses or something like that. And it's not exactly obligatory, but there's a kind, I think it's, it's through a kind of a hierarchical division of labor, that there are certain things in the territory, certain aspects of the territorial strategy which are decided centrally and others which are decided locally. So in a sense, you don't have a complete separation of the strategy of the local strategy from the central one doesn't determine the local one, but certain aspects of what happens locally will be centrally determined. And I suppose that's the yes. So I suppose the central government strategy, if it will determine those aspects of local strategy which are of national importance. So maybe some environmental issues, maybe something to do with infrastructure, that will be done nationally. Other aspects like, developing, jobs or businesses, that could be that could be done according to local priorities. But so I suppose the answer would be not to have a complete separation between the strategies of the two levels.
Thanks so much, Dr. Adrian. Professor Alex?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this is where this good old-fashioned, quote unquote, some of you might not like it, good old-fashioned reinventing government principle comes in, right? National government provides a strategy, and the local government's steering and rowing. There was a book, in fact, I think Dr. Fadil wrote a book about reinventing government in Indonesia. I think the principle is so right. National government provides the whole direction, and local government provides the rowing. But the problem sometimes is national government is just so obsessed with its power that it goes down to the local government, changing the mindsets, how to let them go. Like I told you, I was once with the Ministry of Local Government, and what drove me crazy is sometimes my colleagues at the central government say, oh, we have to teach them. I mean, the mindset, excuse me, they should teach us and not them, because they know more, because they're the ones who are out there. And our job is still to provide the perspective. So it's really this whole open mind. So it's really decentralization. It's really pushing the envelope of local empowerment. But after having said that, definitely, let's not romanticize the local governments, because they need national government. So it's really this whole notion of I guess you might call it subsidiarity. What should be done at the lowest level should be done. But certainly, there are things that national government knows. I mean, I know Indonesia has been working decentralization since the late 2000s, right? And we're still pushing that. In the Philippines, because there was a question earlier, I think raised by one, what have we done as an academic and also we've been pushing the envelope of decentralization for the past 30 years. And it has become policy, I must mention. Not for anything, without being presumptuous, we've been part of writing our local government code. And right now, we're pushing for it to be even further. At one point, we've talked about the importance of federalism, because we believe that at one point, it could be really a whole notion of really local empowerment. But federalism, Philippine style, context is very, very, very important. Forget if you don't call it federalism, but at the end of the day, it sounds so romantic. But let the locals decide. But after having said that, national government should still provide the framework. Yeah, you might have your critique of reinventing government, but there are certain principles that are quite important. Looking beyond who thought of the principle, but appropriately contextualized, focusing on our North Star, focusing on our vision, in spite of the fact that, hey, politicians are there, but hey, remember this whole good old-fashioned dichotomy, and we cannot do away with politicians. They are there. We have to live with them. But at the end of the day, the bureaucracy continues to provide stability and continuity. And that's what Dr. Adrian mentioned in quoting Cummings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Alex. Before we end our webinar, so this webinar is actually have participated by more than 500 participants, I think, policy analysts from various ministries and also local governments. So I would like to ask you to give a closing statement for motivating our policy analysts as a profession in the governments. So please, closing statement from Dr. Adrian and also Professor Alex Vilante to our analysts.
I think it follows on from what Professor Brillante was just saying, that it's not just the system you have, it's also the relationships within it, that there needs to be respect within the system for the roles at different levels, and there needs to be respect for different policy positions, and so that there is a proper debate. And too often in recent years, we have one side or other wants to monopolize the discussion and doesn't appreciate the other position. And so I think, yeah, in a sense, what I'm saying is almost a return to what used to be called corporatism, where you have different partners, they have different interests, but they respect each other's positions, and they can therefore debate and negotiate on that basis.
Thanks, Dr. Adrian. Professor Alex, please.
Oh, I certainly agree with Dr. Adrian. At the end of the day, the ultimate asset of a policy analyst is his integrity and the respect they have for you. The moment they consider you a hack or paid, I mean, there it goes. So I think just focusing on the North Star, for whom. But at the end of the day, since we are all policy analysts, give them the bad news, but give them the good news. But at the end of the day, you give the recommendation. Whether they accept it or not, it's their problem. But you have done your job. And I think because you have been honest to yourself. And I think that's what it is. Honest to yourself, that has been based on your own training, based on your own competencies, because you're trained to be such. Okay. But at the end of the day, it's the minister decides. And maybe one day you yourself will be a minister. So you'll find out how it works. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adrian, Professor Alex. I think we have learned so much from perspective and experiment from Dr. Adrian and Alex. So the most important thing is to develop capacity, capability, and also competencies for policy analysts. Yeah. So Dr. Adrian mentioned about the capacity that should be developed for policy analysts. The second one, your duty is to convince the policymaker about the risk of a policy that will be made by the policymaker. And Professor Alex mentioned about the importance of integrity, ethic and integrity for policy analysts. So thank you very much for speakers, for very honorable speaker, Professor Alex and Dr. Adrian. Thank you very much for also all participants that follow this webinar from the beginning until the end. And I would like to give this floor to Ibu Reni. Please. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bapak Eko Prasojo, for moderating the plenary session. Ladies and gentlemen, we almost reached the end of this fruitful discussion. And before officially closing today's event, we would like to inform you that e-certificate will be sent via email after you fill out the attendance and the evaluation forms through the link that will be shared by the organizer via chat feature at the end of this program. An evaluation form and also post-test will be closed 30 minutes after this webinar ends. Now let me conclude by thanking once again to our keynote speaker, guests of speakers, moderator, and all participants for your contribution and participations. Thank you for joining this webinar via Zoom and our YouTube channel. I hope you find today's event informative and engaging. Stay safe, stay healthy. I'm Reni signing off. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you very much. Stay healthy, Prof. Alex, Dr. Adrian.
Thank you, my friend. I'll see you again. Good to see you again, Dr. Adrian.
See you again offline, ya.
Yeah, see you offline.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you very much.
Sama-sama.
Bye.